For more than 3 decades, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was America's late-night comfort zone. Carson was calm, witty, and in complete control until certain guests walked through the curtain and turned the studio into something closer to chaos than comedy. These weren't just awkward interviews or mildly strange moments. These were appearances so unpredictable, so intense, and sometimes so uncomfortable that even Johnny Carson himself struggled to keep the show on the rails. Some guests arrived clearly detached from reality, rambling through conspiracy theories or spiritual revelations that left the audience stunned into silence. Others were fueled by ego, substances, or pure rage, openly clashing with Carson on live television. There were moments when producers feared lawsuits, moments when cameras didn't know where to cut, and moments when Carson's famous cool cracked, just enough to reveal genuine concern or irritation. What made these encounters unforgettable wasn't just the behavior of the guests, but Carson's reactions. His raised eyebrow, forced laugh, or sudden retreat behind his desk often said more than words ever could. In a time before delay buttons and social media damage control, everything happened live, raw, and unfiltered. One wrong sentence could derail an entire episode, and sometimes it did. Tonight, we're revisiting the most unhinged guests Johnny Carson ever had. The interviews that made audiences gasp, producers panic, and Carson silently wish for a commercial break. These appearances didn't just shock viewers, they became legendary moments that still define. Late-night television decades later, Johnny Carson had an unmatched ability to guide conversations, even when guests were nervous or slightly eccentric. But every so often, someone sat across from him who wasn't just quirky. They were completely unmoored from reality. These guests didn't simply challenge Carson's wit. They challenged the very structure of live television. One of the most unsettling examples was Criswell, the self-proclaimed psychic and pop culture oddity. Criswell spoke in prophetic riddles, stared blankly into the camera, and made grand predictions about the future with absolute seriousness. His speech patterns were slow, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Carson tried to play along, tossing in light jokes, but Criswell never broke character. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or worry. Behind the scenes, producers reportedly debated cutting the interview short, but Carson pushed forward, believing the tension itself had become the entertainment. Then there was Charles Manson, whose appearance, though heavily edited and controversial, left a permanent scar on The Tonight Show's legacy. Manson didn't shout or joke. He stared. He spoke in cryptic phrases about society, music, and control, turning the studio atmosphere cold and uncomfortable. Carson's posture changed. His jokes slowed. This was no longer a late-night interview, it was a psychological standoff. Viewers at home sensed it immediately, and many later described the segment as genuinely disturbing rather than entertaining. Another unforgettable moment came from Dr. Timothy Leary, the counterculture icon and outspoken advocate of psychedelic experiences. Unlike other guests, Leary was articulate, but his thoughts spiraled into long, philosophical monologues that made little sense to mainstream audiences. He challenged social norms, questioned reality itself, and subtly mocked Carson's role as a gatekeeper of normalcy. Carson tried to rein him in with humor, but Leary's calm intensity made the exchange feel like an ideological clash, rather than a friendly chat. Perhaps the most chaotic appearances came from guests who seemed chemically altered. Musicians, actors, and fringe personalities occasionally arrived visibly under the influence, slurring words, interrupting Carson, or laughing at nothing. In one particularly infamous episode, a guest repeatedly forgot the question halfway through answering it, forcing Carson to politely redirect the conversation again and again. The audience laughed, but the tension in Carson's face revealed discomfort rather than amusement. What tied all these moments together wasn't just strange behavior, it was unpredictability. Carson thrived on timing, rhythm, and control. These guests disrupted all three. Long pauses replaced punchlines. Dead air lingered longer than it ever should have. Carson's trademark confidence turned into quick improvisation damage control. Yet, these unhinged appearances also exposed Carson's brilliance. He never yelled. He never openly humiliated a guest. Instead, he used subtle humor, raised eyebrows, and carefully chosen words to guide the show back from the brink. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Single quotes teed up by the end of these interviews. Audiences weren't sure what they just watched, but they knew it wasn't normal. And that unpredictability, as uncomfortable as it was, became part of The Tonight Show's legend. These weren't just bad interviews. They were moments when reality itself seemed to live on television. And Johnny Carson was the only thing standing between chaos and complete collapse. Not all of Johnny Carson's most unhinged guests were detached from reality or lost in strange philosophies. Some were fully aware of where they were and simply didn't care. These were the guests whose egos were so large and temper so short that The Tonight Show became a battleground instead of a talk show. In these moments, Carson wasn't managing confusion. He was managing confrontation. One of the clearest examples was Don Rickles, a frequent guest whose insult comedy regularly pushed boundaries. While Rickles was often hilarious, there were nights when his attacks crossed from playful to aggressive. He mocked Carson's appearance, his staff, even the audience, sometimes refusing to back down when Carson tried to redirect the bit. The tension was subtle but real. Carson, a master of restraint, would smile tightly or fire back with a sharper-than-usual jab, signaling that control was slipping. Viewers could sense that the line between comedy and genuine irritation had blurred. Then there was Robert Blake, whose appearances carried an undercurrent of hostility. Blake often challenged Carson's questions, interrupted him mid-sentence, and spoke with a simmering defensiveness that made the studio uneasy. Unlike entertainers who played to the crowd, Blake seemed almost confrontational, as if daring Carson or the audience to misunderstand him. Carson adjusted his tone, becoming quieter and more measured, a clear sign he was navigating dangerous territory. Some confrontations weren't rooted in anger but in arrogance. Certain actors arrived believing they were bigger than the show itself. They talked over Carson, dismissed his jokes, and treated the interview like a personal monologue. One guest repeatedly corrected Carson on trivial details, turning what should have been light banter into an awkward power struggle. Carson's polite nods and forced laughs masked frustration, but the imbalance was obvious. Perhaps the most infamous ego-driven clashes came from guests who felt wronged by Hollywood or by Carson himself. On rare occasions, guests used the show as a platform to air grievances, criticizing studios, critics, or the industry in general. Carson tried to steer these rants away from bitterness, but some guests refused, digging deeper with each sentence. The audience applause faded, replaced by uneasy silence. Alcohol often made these situations worse. A guest who might normally be charming could become combative after a few drinks, misinterpreting jokes as insults and responding with sharp remarks. Carson, ever the professional, would de-escalate with humor or abruptly move the conversation along, sometimes signaling the band to play earlier than planned. To casual viewers, it looked smooth. Behind the scenes, it was controlled panic. What made these moments so compelling was Carson's restraint. He never raised his voice. He never stormed off. Instead, he relied on timing, wit, and subtle authority. A well-placed pause. A dry one-liner. A sudden shift to commercial. These were his weapons, yet even Carson had limits. There were interviews where his smile faded completely, replaced by a flat, neutral expression that spoke volumes. In those moments, the audience knew something had gone wrong. The guest hadn't just disrupted the show, they'd challenged. The king of late night on his own stage, these explosive encounters reminded viewers that The Tonight Show wasn't always safe. Rehearsed entertainment. Sometimes it was live, volatile, and unpredictable. And when egos collided with Carson's calm authority, the sparks were impossible to ignore. Some of the most unhinged guests in The Tonight Show history didn't arrive angry or unstable, they arrived with a plan. These were the guests who believed shock value was entertainment, who used stunts, props, and outrageous behavior to hijack the show in real time. For Johnny Carson, these appearances were the most dangerous of all, because once the chaos started, there was no easy way to stop it. One of the most infamous examples involved guests who brought demonstrations that were barely cleared with producers. What sounded harmless backstage quickly became a liability on air. Objects were smashed, liquids were spilled, and equipment was put at risk. Carson's desk, normally a symbol of control, became ground zero for unpredictability. When a stunt went wrong, Carson's laughter often froze halfway, replaced by quick glances toward the crew, silently asking whether to cut to commercial. Comedians were especially risky. Some believed pushing boundaries meant ignoring every cue Carson gave. They interrupted him, mocked the format, and treated the show like an open mic instead of a nationally broadcast program. One guest repeatedly stood up mid-interview, pacing the stage and addressing the audience directly, completely breaking the rhythm of the show. Carson tried to regain control with jokes, but the guest fed off the disruption, escalating with each passing minute. Musicians, too, sometimes turned performances into spectacles. Instruments were thrown, lyrics were changed to provoke reactions, and unexpected rants replaced rehearsed songs. In one unforgettable moment, a performer used their airtime to launch into an unscripted tirade, ignoring Carson entirely. The band didn't know whether to play them off or sit in stunned silence. Carson's expression said it all. This was not what was booked. Then there were the physical stunts, guests who climbed furniture, invaded Carson's personal space, or brought animals that clearly weren't under control. What began as novelty often teetered into danger. Carson, who valued professionalism above all else, leaned heavily on subtle cues, stepping back, folding his arms, or suddenly addressing the camera instead of the guest. These small shifts were his way of signaling that the situation was spiraling. Live television made everything worse. There were no delay buttons, no editing safety nets. If a guest said something inappropriate or did something reckless, millions of viewers saw it instantly. Carson had to react in real time, balancing humor with authority. Sometimes he succeeded, turning disaster into laughter. Other times, the awkwardness lingered unfixable. Behind the scenes, producers were furious. Guests who crossed the line were quietly added to an unofficial blacklist, never invited back. Some appearances became cautionary tales passed down through staff, reminders of what could happen when control was lost. What made these moments unforgettable wasn't just the shock, it was Carson's composure. Even when his desk was shaken, his script derailed, or his patience tested, he remained seated, calm, and observant. His restraint became the contrast that made the chaos feel even bigger. By the time the credits rolled, audiences felt like they'd witnessed something forbidden, television slipping out of its carefully planned structure. These weren't just stunts gone wrong. They were reminders that live TV in the wrong hands could turn into a spectacle no one, not even Johnny Carson, could fully control. By the time The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson reached its peak, the producers knew one thing for certain. Some guests were simply too unpredictable to risk bringing back. The most unhinged appearances didn't just create awkward moments, they left lasting scars on the show's booking process, security rules, and even Johnny Carson himself. These guests didn't just cross lines. They forced the show to redraw them. After several chaotic interviews, stricter pre-show screenings quietly became the norm. Producers began vetting guests more carefully, especially those known for erratic behavior, substance issues, or extreme views. What the audience never saw was the growing tension, backstage security staff standing closer, segment timings shortened, and contingency plans prepared in case a guest went off the rails. These changes were a direct response to the unhinged moments that had nearly derailed the show in the past. Johnny Carson also evolved. In earlier years, he leaned heavily into improvisation, allowing guests to roam freely. But as the unpredictable appearances piled up, his style subtly shifted. He became more guarded, more selective with his questions, and quicker to cut to commercial. When a guest started rambling or escalating, Carson no longer tried to save the moment at all costs. Sometimes, silence became his strongest response. Some guests were never invited back, and everyone in the industry knew why. Their names became cautionary whispers among booking agents. One disastrous appearance could end a late-night career overnight. Carson rarely commented publicly, but his actions spoke volumes. If a guest embarrassed the show, endangered the crew, or crossed an unspoken boundary, they were quietly erased from future schedules. What made these moments so powerful was the cultural impact. In an era without viral clips or social media outrage, viewers still talked. Word of mouth turned these appearances into legends. People remembered exactly where they were when a guest lost control, said something shocking, or made Carson visibly uncomfortable. These weren't just TV moments, they were shared national experiences. Ironically, the chaos helped define Carson's legacy. His calm presence during absolute disorder became a masterclass in live broadcasting. Future hosts studied those moments, learning what to do and what not to do when control slips away. David Letterman, Jay Leno, and countless others took notes, understanding that authority on late-night TV wasn't about dominance but composure. Even decades later, these unhinged appearances continue to resurface in retrospectives and documentaries. Clips are replayed, expressions analyzed, and pauses dissected. Carson's raised eyebrow during a guest's meltdown says more than any punchline ever could. It was the look of a man realizing, in real time, that the show had crossed into dangerous territory. In the end, The Tonight Show survived because of Carson, not in spite of these guests, but partly because of them. The chaos highlighted his control. The madness emphasized his restraint. And the unhinged guests, as uncomfortable as they were, became part of the show's mythology. They remind us that live television is fragile. One unpredictable guest can turn a carefully planned broadcast into history. And no one understood that better than Johnny Carson, sitting behind his desk, holding the line between entertainment and complete, unforgettable chaos.